Part 1. In the heart of London, in the mid-19th century, a new rhythm began to beat, a stark and jarring contrast to the slow, heavy cadence of history. It was a city perpetually shrouded in a grimy, suffocating fog, a dense blanket woven from the damp air of the River Thames and the relentless soot of 1,000 factory smokestacks. At night, the gas lights on the cobbled streets cut through the gloom like lonely, flickering stars, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and warped in the perpetual haze. By day, the sun was a weak, distant ghost, a faint smudge in a sky perpetually stained with the black and grey hues of industry. Every street corner was a stage for the clash of old and new, the silent permanence of the past confronting the clamorous, unyielding momentum of the future. The air itself was a symphony of contradictions, the sweet scent of morning bakeries mingling with the acrid smell of coal fires, the sharp tang of horse manure mixing with the metallic aroma of steam. It was in this great, chaotic, and beautiful city that the life of Elias, a young apprentice to his stonemason father, was shaped by the constant chime of chisel against stone, a sound that was both a lullaby and a promise of a life to come. His father, Gideon, was a man carved from the very same rock he dedicated his life to. His hands were not just tools, they were the living memory of a craft that stretched back to the Roman arches and the Egyptian obelisks. To Gideon, a building was not merely a structure, it was a testament to human will, a sacred and enduring monument to be passed down through generations. He believed, with an almost religious conviction, that for a building to stand for 1,000 years, its foundations had to be of stone, its walls raised with the unwavering strength of rock. His workshop, nestled in a quiet alley off the main thoroughfare, was a bastion of this belief. It was a place that smelled of limestone dust and the sharp, clean scent of newly broken granite. Old stone mallets lay scattered on the dirt floor, their heads worn smooth by years of use. Chisels of various sizes, with worn wooden handles and keen iron tips, hung neatly on a rack, each one a silent record of 1,000 careful strikes. Gideon would often speak to Elias about the language of stone. Each stone has a grain, a soul, a secret inside it. My boy, he would say, his voice a low rumble, filled with a profound reverence. You must listen to it. You must feel its resistance. A hurried hand breaks the stone's heart. A patient hand reveals its true form. He taught Elias to recognize the different types of stone, to feel the subtle variations in their texture and hardness. He taught him to read the natural fault lines in a block of marble, to anticipate how a slab of granite would respond to a blow. Elias's own hands, growing tough and calloused with each passing year, learned to speak this language of stone. He could carve a smooth, perfect surface on a block of freestone, set a keystone in an arch with unerring precision, and understand the immense weight of a stone block as if it were a natural extension of his own body. He was, by all accounts, a promising apprentice, a dutiful son destined to follow in his father's footsteps. Yet, his spirit, unlike his father's, was not drawn to the stolid, timeless permanence of stone. It was captivated by the ephemeral, dynamic grace of the new age. He would stand at the edge of the London docks, watching the iron-hulled steamships belch smoke into the sky, their great engines of furious, rhythmic pulse against the quiet lapping of the water. He would hear the distant clang of the steam hammer at the foundry, a sound that spoke of a power his father's mallets could never comprehend. The city around him was a living, breathing testament to this new power. The soot-stained, red brick factories, their hundreds of windows like staring eyes, were raising their iron skeletons higher and faster than any stone cathedral had ever risen. The new bridges, their latticework of iron arches a triumph of modern engineering, spanned the Thames with a delicate strength that was breathtaking. The silent conflict between Elias and his father was born from this divide. Gideon viewed iron with suspicion and disdain, his contempt for the new material a profound philosophical stance. "Iron is tired," he would scoff, his voice filled with a quiet, ancient contempt. "It rusts over time, it bends, it grows weak. It is a thing of man's fleeting vanity." "But a stone," he would say, his hand tracing the rough surface of a limestone block, "a stone is patient. It stands the same 1,000 years later, a witness to the follies of men." He saw the new age not as progress, but as a dangerous shortcut, a flimsy substitute for the true, honest work of a craftsman's hands. Elias, however, saw something different. He didn't see iron as a material that succumbed to time, but as a spirit that was forged in fire, a will that was shaped by a craftsman's deliberate hand. He saw its potential for breathtaking lightness and impossible scale. His fascination with the new world was a quiet obsession. He found his greatest inspiration and his only true sanctuary in a place he visited every weekend, a brand new creation in Hyde Park known as the Crystal Palace. He had heard tales of it from other boys in the city. Rumors of a glass castle built in a single season, a miracle of engineering that seemed to have sprung from the ground overnight. As Elias approached it for the first time, he felt a sense of quiet awe that bordered on the spiritual. The massive building seemed to be made of air, its glass panels shimmering under the sun, reflecting the clouds and the endless sky. It was so unlike the heavy, grounded structures he was used to. It didn't stand upon the earth with a solemn weight, it seemed to float above it, an ethereal masterpiece held aloft by a skeleton of slender iron columns and delicate trusses. When he stepped inside, the outside world of grey skies and sooty streets melted away completely. He was transported to a luminous, verdant world. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of tropical plants and exotic flowers he had only seen in illustrations. Sunlight poured through the thousands of glass panes, creating a breathtaking play of light and shadow on the polished floor and the fronds of towering ferns. Every single glass panel, like a painter's careful brush stroke, brought the infinite expanse of the heavens into a terrestrial space. Inside, Elias would walk for hours, his hands tracing the cold, smooth surface of the iron columns. He would look up at the intricate tracery of the roof, the perfect geometry of the iron ribs that supported the glass like a spider's web. He saw not a building, but a perfect idea. An idea that a structure could be light, that it could be transparent, that it could connect the man-made world with the natural one in a seamless, fluid way. This was what he wanted to build. He wanted to combine the permanence of stone with the ethereal grace of iron and the luminous beauty of glass. The vision of a building that was both as solid as a cathedral and as light as a greenhouse was burned into his mind. This dream became a quiet obsession. Every evening, after his father had retired for the night and the only sounds were the distant chimes of the church bells, Elias would light a single, flickering candle in his small room. He would pull out his hidden stack of paper scraps and his worn charcoal pencil. He would sketch, his hand moving with a feverish intensity. He drew not the heavy, Roman arches of the past, but slender, impossibly tall curves of iron and glass, inspired by the Gothic windows of the old cathedral he worked on. His pencil strokes were a way of charting a new riverbed, of creating a new path for human thought. He drew repeating iron frames, the way they would support a glass roof, the way light would pour through them. His drawings were full of light, a stark contrast to the heavy, dense world of his daily life. These sketches were a secret rebellion, a physical manifestation of his internal world. They were a testament to a dream of combining the strength of stone with the power of iron. But they were only drawings on paper, silent and hidden. In the real world, Elias was still a stonemason's apprentice, working in his father's shadow, carrying the immense weight of the past. He knew that to voice such a dream, to speak of building with iron and glass, would be seen as a profound betrayal in his father's eyes, a disrespect to the legacy of the master builders. But the wind was changing. The city was singing a new song of steam and smoke, and Elias knew that he had to find his own voice within it. He carried the burden of this dream silently, waiting. He knew that when the time was right, he wouldn't just be carving stone, he would be laying the first foundation for a monument that would define an entire new age. Part 2. The Forge of Ambition. Elias's double life, split between the stone dust of his father's workshop and the luminous dream of his secret sketches, could not last forever. It was a tension, a silent fissure that widened with each passing day. The rhythmic chiming of Gideon's chisel, once a comforting sound, now felt like the relentless ticking of a clock counting down the moments until his true ambitions would be exposed. His hands, still strong and practiced in the art of masonry, felt a growing distance from the cold, unyielding nature of stone. He no longer saw it as a living thing to be coaxed, but as a heavy, immovable object that tethered him to a world he was desperate to leave behind. The inciting incident came not from a dramatic event, but from a mundane one, as so many life-altering moments do. The winter had been particularly brutal, and a portion of a new aqueduct, built with a shoddy mix of brick and quick-setting mortar, had collapsed, causing a minor flood in a nearby district. The city was in an uproar, the papers filled with condemnation of the so-called modern building techniques. Gideon, his face a mask of solemn vindication, spent a full afternoon lecturing Elias on the permanence of true craftsmanship. "They build with haste," he said, his voice low and heavy, "with shortcuts and cheap materials. They chase speed, not eternity. This is the folly of their age, this fascination with the temporary." He held up a perfectly squared block of granite, its surface a testament to his careful work. "This," he declared, "will outlast 1,000 of their flimsy contraptions." Elias, for a moment, saw the truth in his father's words. He understood the pride of building something that would stand for a millennium. But his mind, even as he listened, was a whirl of different thoughts. He wasn't thinking of the brick and mortar that had failed, but of the strength of the iron trusses in the Crystal Palace, of the elegant geometry of the railway bridges. These structures were not weak, they were a different kind of strong. He felt a desperate need to explain this to his father, to bridge the gap between their worlds. That evening, unable to bear the weight of his secret any longer, Elias made a decision. He would show his father his sketches, not as a challenge, but as an offering. He would present his vision, a synthesis of their two worlds. He waited until Gideon was seated by the fireplace, the familiar scent of wood smoke filling the small room, and laid the stack of sketches on the table between them. His hands trembled slightly, a mixture of fear and quiet resolve. Gideon looked at the sketches, his expression unreadable at first. He picked one up, a drawing of a vast, light-filled hall with a soaring glass roof supported by a delicate lattice of iron. The lines were precise, the proportions perfect. A flicker of something, perhaps professional respect, crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a profound and heavy sadness. He laid the sketch down as if it were a fragile, dangerous thing. "What is this, Elias?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of its usual warmth. Elias began to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush of long-held passion. "It is the future, Father. It is a building that can hold light, that can defy gravity. We can use iron for its strength, and glass for its beauty. We can build higher, wider, with more elegance than ever before." He pointed to the drawings. "Look, it is not flimsy. The iron gives it strength, and the glass gives it a soul. We can combine the honesty of our work with the power of the new age." Gideon did not look at the drawings. He looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a deep, crushing disappointment. "This is not our world, my son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the world of machines, of mass production, of things that are made, not created. A stone building is a conversation between a craftsman and the earth. This is a factory product. There is no soul in it. You have forgotten the lessons I taught you." His words were not an argument, they were a final verdict. He saw Elias not as a new kind of builder, but as a lost son who had turned his back on his heritage. The confrontation was over as quickly as it began. Gideon rose and walked to his workbench, his back a rigid, unyielding wall. Elias stood there, his offering rejected, the silence of the room heavier than any stone block. He knew then that the two worlds could not coexist. He had to choose. And in that moment, the path forward became terrifyingly clear. The next morning, before the city had fully woken, Elias packed a small satchel with a change of clothes, his precious sketches, and a few coins. He left a note for his father, a simple, heartfelt apology for the pain he had caused, and a promise that he would one day make him proud. He walked out of the workshop, past the silent stones, each one a monument to a past he could no longer inhabit. He was leaving not just a physical place, but a way of life, a philosophy that had defined his entire existence. His journey took him to the grimy, bustling district of Birmingham, where the air was thick with the smell of molten metal and the furious sound of steam hammers. This was the heart of the new age, a place where iron was not just a tool but a language. He found a job as a simple laborer in a sprawling foundry, a place where men, their faces grimed with soot, worked tirelessly to forge the new world from fire and iron. The heat was immense, the noise deafening, a world away from the quiet discipline of a stonemason's shop. Here, the work was brutal, not artistic, but Elias didn't care. He needed to be close to the material, to learn its secrets, to understand its true nature not from a book but from the hammer in his hand. He spent his nights in a crowded, cheap lodging house, still sketching, still dreaming. He was a stonemason's son in a land of iron workers, an artist in a world of machines. But he was here for a purpose. He was here to prove that a new kind of beauty could be forged from the heart of the industrial age, a beauty as honest and as enduring as his father's stones, but with the soaring, hopeful grace of the modern age. Part 3. The forge's heart. The air of Birmingham was not the misty, coal-tinged breath of London, but a solid, hot gasp of industry. It was a city that did not hide its purpose. Its lifeblood was the rhythm of the steam hammer and the furious roar of the blast furnaces. For Elias, it was a world away from the quiet, rhythmic tapping of his father's workshop. Here, the ground itself seemed to vibrate with a constant, low thrum, and the sky was a perpetual canvas of orange and red from the glow of 1,000 fires. He was no longer an apprentice carving a life from stone. He was a silent wanderer in the heart of a new, molten world. His first weeks in the foundry were a brutal lesson in humility. The work was not an art form, it was a test of endurance. He was given a heavy hammer and a simple task: to clear away the cooled slag from the iron molds. The heat was immense, a searing force that turned his linen tunic into a sweat-soaked rag within moments. The noise was a physical presence, a deafening symphony of clanging metal, the grinding of gears, and the hiss of steam escaping from pressure valves. Men moved with a practiced, weary efficiency, their faces and arms perpetually grimed with soot, their eyes narrowed against the blinding flashes of light from the molten iron. Elias, with his pale hands and quiet demeanor, was an outsider, a ghost from another time. The other workers paid him little mind, their focus entirely on the dangerous, demanding tasks at hand. His boss, a gruff, scarred man with a permanent scowl named Master Thomas, had the look of a man who had seen 1,000 failures and 1,000 victories forged in fire. Thomas had asked Elias what he knew of iron. Elias had answered honestly, "Only what I have seen and what I have read." Thomas had grunted in response, "Then you know nothing. Iron has its own language. You learn it with your hands, not your head. Here, we don't think about it, we feel it." And so, Elias learned to feel it. He learned the searing heat that radiated from the furnaces, the way the air would shimmer and distort over the glowing metal. He learned to read the subtle shift in color of the molten iron as it was poured, a silent signal of its temperature and purity. He learned the bone-jarring shock of the hammer as it struck the cool slag, and the specific way a forged iron beam would ring when tapped, a sound that told of its structural integrity. His hands, once accustomed to the patient work of the chisel, now knew the raw, untamed power of the furnace. He would return to his cramped, sooty room each night, his body aching, his face and arms covered in a fine layer of soot and sweat. He would fall into a deep, dreamless sleep, only to wake with the dawn, drawn back to the chaotic heart of the forge. But even in this brutal environment, Elias's mind, the mind of an architect, could not be silenced. He saw beyond the raw labor. He saw the potential in the material, the way it could be shaped and formed to serve a purpose far beyond the simple beams and girders being produced. He noticed the waste, the small inefficiencies in the casting process that the experienced workers, blinded by years of routine, no longer saw. One afternoon, a large, intricate mold for a new railway station column was causing problems. The molten iron, cooled too quickly, was cracking at a delicate curve, rendering the entire piece useless. The foreman was furious, cursing the material and the heat. Master Thomas stood watching, his arms crossed, a familiar look of weary resignation on his face. Elias, who had been tasked with clearing a nearby area, watched from a distance. His architectural mind began to work, not on the grand design of a building, but on the simple flow of the molten metal. He saw the problem not as a failure of the iron, but as a flaw in the mold's design. The curve was too sharp, causing the metal to cool unevenly. He approached Master Thomas with a hesitancy born of his outsider status. "Master," he said, his voice barely audible over the din. "The problem is not the iron. The curve is too tight. If we were to soften the angle, just slightly, the metal would flow more evenly and cool without stress." Thomas's scowl deepened. "And what do you know of casting, boy? You're a mason. Go back to your work." But Elias, his resolve strengthened by the sheer confidence of his observation, persisted. "I know nothing of casting, master, but I know the way a line should flow. A proper curve distributes stress evenly, whether in stone or in iron. The heat is like a river, a sharp bend will always cause a logjam. Thomas paused, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He looked from Elias's earnest face to the flawed mold and then back again. He said nothing, but the next morning, he had the pattern makers subtly alter the design of the mold. When the new casting was made, the column came out perfectly, its surface a testament to a quiet, invisible change. From that day on, Master Thomas began to see Elias not as a green laborer, but as something more. He started to watch him, to test him with harder questions, to give him more complex tasks. He was teaching Elias not just how to work with iron, but how to think with it. Elias, in turn, began to understand the language of iron that Master Thomas had spoken of. He learned that iron was not a static material like stone, it was a living thing. It expanded and contracted, its strength the direct result of the fire and force that shaped it. He learned about alloys, the subtle additions of other metals that could change its properties completely, making it harder, more pliable, or more resistant to rust. He felt the raw power of the industrial age in his hands and knew that this was the very essence he would need to bring his dream to life. He was no longer just a dreamer, he was a learner, a practitioner. The quiet ambition he had carried from his father's workshop was now being forged in the heart of the furnace, hardened and strengthened by the very elements his father had so feared. He was not a mason who had forgotten his craft, he was a new kind of builder, one who understood the soul of both the stone of the past and the iron of the future. He still had his sketches, but now, he looked at them with a new kind of understanding. He could see not just the lines on the page, but the way the iron would groan under the weight of the glass, the way it would hold and support the light. One day, while working late, he overheard two foremen talking. They spoke of a competition, a grand project to build a new railway station in London, a gateway to the capital that would be a symbol of the new age. The design had to be both functional and a work of art, a structure that would awe the world. It would require a grand, soaring roof, the likes of which had never been seen before. Elias listened, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the opportunity he had been searching for, a project that would require both the vision of an architect and the understanding of a craftsman. This was the place where he could finally merge his two worlds and prove his father wrong. Part 4, The Architect's Dilemma. The news of the railway station competition was a single, clear note in the cacophony of the Birmingham foundry. For Elias, it was not just a rumor, it was a calling, a direct challenge from the world to which he now belonged. He carried the knowledge of iron in his hands and the dream of a new architecture in his mind. He knew, with a certainty that burned away all his doubts, that this was his moment. This was the project that would allow him to prove his father wrong, to reconcile the silent dignity of stone with the elegant power of iron, and to bring his luminous vision to life. He gave his notice to Master Thomas, who, to Elias's surprise, showed a flicker of pride in his weathered eyes. "Go on, then, Mason," Thomas grumbled, his voice lacking its usual gruffness. "You've learned what you needed here. Now go build your cathedrals. But remember, fire is a good master, and a hard one. Don't you ever forget what it feels like." Thomas slipped a worn, leather pouch into Elias's hand. Inside were enough coins to see him back to London and support him for a few weeks. It was a gesture of respect, a final lesson in the unspoken language of the forge. The journey back to London felt different. The same landscapes, the same roads, and the same familiar sense now held a new meaning. The city, which he had once viewed as a monolith of stone and tradition, now appeared as a vibrant, breathing organism of metal and glass. He saw the iron trusses of every bridge not as a temporary solution but as an art form. He noticed the great glass domes of the new market halls, not just as buildings but as vessels of light. He was no longer just an observer, he was a participant, armed with the knowledge of how these modern marvels were truly made, forged in the furnace and shaped by the hands of men like Master Thomas. He knew he could not enter the competition on his own. He was an unlettered apprentice, a laborer with no official standing in the world of professional architects. The design submissions would be vetted by a council of venerable, stone-minded men who would see his drawings and dismiss them as the crude scribblings of a craftsman without a title. He needed a partner, a name, a professional legitimacy. He needed an architect with the vision to understand his work and the courage to defy the establishment. Elias spent days searching, poring over architectural journals in the city's reading rooms. He discovered that the world of architecture was just as rigid as the world of stonemasonry. The old guard, with their focus on classical revival and Gothic styles, looked down on the new materials. They called them vulgar and soulless. But then, he stumbled upon an article that had been rejected from a prominent journal, published instead in a small, obscure engineering pamphlet. The author was a woman named Eleanor Vance. Her essay argued passionately that iron and glass were not just building materials but a new form of artistic expression, a way to build with light and air, to create structures that were both honest and ethereal. The essay was filled with bold ideas and a clear, elegant vision. It was the architectural equivalent of his own secret sketches. Elias found her address in the city directory and, with a heart pounding a rhythm that was a mix of both fear and resolve, set out to find her. He found her office in a small, unassuming building in a less fashionable part of the city. The other offices were closed for the day, their windows dark, but light spilled from Eleanor Vance's, a beacon in the gathering gloom. He found her at her drawing board, her face illuminated by a single gas lamp. She was younger than he had imagined, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The room was not the clean, ordered space of a grand architectural firm. It was a beautiful chaos. Blueprints were scattered across the floor, models of new buildings sat on every available surface, and a faint smell of ink and coffee hung in the air. Elias hesitated for a moment, his hand poised to knock. He was a laborer, his clothes still smelling faintly of coal smoke and his hands rough with calluses. She was an architect, an intellectual. But then he saw a small model of an iron dome on her desk, its delicate form so like the ideas in his own head, and he knocked. Eleanor looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and weary suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clear and precise. Elias, his words fumbling at first, explained who he was and why he had come. He spoke of his father, the stonemason, and his time in the Birmingham foundries. He then pulled the rolled-up sketches from his satchel and laid them on her desk, the papers slightly smudged with soot and dust. "I've been thinking about this competition," he said, his voice gaining confidence, "and I believe I have an idea, but I cannot submit it without a proper architect to help me." Eleanor unrolled the sketches slowly, her initial suspicion giving way to a quiet, intense concentration. She looked at the drawings, at the graceful, curving roof of iron, the immense glass panels designed to flood the interior with light. She saw the practicality of the design, the way the iron trusses were engineered to bear the load with minimal material, a stark contrast to the heavy, wasteful designs of the past. Her gaze lingered on a detailed drawing of a joint where a glass panel met an iron rib, and she saw the mind of a craftsman at work. She looked up at Elias, her eyes wide with a quiet astonishment. "These are not just sketches," she said softly. "This is an entirely new language." She had spent years fighting against the old guard, arguing for the very principles Elias had discovered on his own. She saw in his designs not just a blueprint for a building, but a shared philosophy, a partnership waiting to be formed. "I will help you," she said, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce resolve. "They will laugh at our design. They will call it a monstrosity. But we will show them that beauty is not found in old stone, but in honest form and light." And so, the partnership was formed. Elias, with his calloused hands and a deep understanding of the soul of iron, and Eleanor, with her brilliant mind and the elegant geometry of her designs. Their collaboration was a beautiful, chaotic dance. They worked long into the nights, arguing over a single curve, a single joint. Elias would draw, his hand now moving with a new confidence, sketching the graceful forms he had dreamed of. Eleanor would translate his vision into formal architectural drawings, adding her own precise calculations and mathematical rigor. They were two sides of the same coin, the craftsman and the theorist, the hand and the mind. The great railway station of their dreams began to take form on the drafting board, a breathtaking fusion of the old world's strength and the new world's elegance. It was a monument that would be both a gateway to a city and a symbol of a new age, a perfect marriage of stone and steel, of light and shadow, and of the two lost souls who had found their purpose in the city's heart. Part 5, The Glass Fortress. The little office in the unfashionable part of the city became a world unto itself, a quiet vortex of ambition and creative chaos. The rhythm of Elias's life, once dictated by the patient chipping of the chisel and the thunderous roar of the forge, now fell into a new, more frantic cadence. He and Eleanor worked tirelessly, their days and nights blurring into a single, continuous stream of thought and purpose. The air was thick with the scent of ink, the faint whisper of charcoal, and the bitter taste of cold coffee. They were two minds, from two vastly different worlds, striving to build a single, unified vision. Their collaboration was not without its friction. Elias, with his hands-on knowledge and intuitive grasp of the material, would often draw with a fluid, organic line, prioritizing the inherent strength and flow of iron. Eleanor, with her formal training, would counter with precise mathematical calculations, insisting on the cold, hard logic of angles and loads. They argued over the simplest things, the pitch of a roof, the curve of an arch, the dimensions of a single joint. Elias would gesture wildly, describing how the iron would feel the stress, how it would sing under pressure. Eleanor would respond by calmly drawing a graph, her pencil moving with unwavering precision, to demonstrate the exact point of failure. Yet, in this beautiful, intellectual clash, a new kind of architecture was being born. Elias's instinctual understanding of a material forged in fire and his knowledge of its inherent properties gave their design a grounded, unyielding honesty. Eleanor's rigorous training gave it the structural integrity and elegant geometry that would allow it to soar. They were two sides of the same coin, and together, they were building a monument to their shared philosophy. As they worked, news of the competition spread through the city's architectural circles. The old guard, represented by the venerable Sir Alistair Finch and his firm, were the favorites. Their designs were a predictable tribute to the past, a grand, stone edifice in the Roman Revival style, heavy and solemn, with a roof of lead and a fa section 8 of carved stone. They mocked the upstart architects who dared to propose buildings of mere iron and glass, deriding the new materials as a temporary fad. A building should not look like a greenhouse or a railway car, Sir Alister was quoted as saying in the local papers. It should stand for the eternal glory of our city, solid and unyielding. The words stung, but they only fueled Elias and Eleanor's resolve. They were not building a monument to the past, they were building a gateway to the future. Their design, which they had come to call the Glass Fortress, was a direct answer to Sir Alister's scorn. It was a masterpiece of simplicity and scale. The central roof was a single, immense span of glass, supported by a graceful, repeating pattern of iron trusses that fanned out from the walls. The exterior was a mix of traditional brick and stone, grounding the building in the city's heritage, but it was merely a supporting structure for the true star of the show, the soaring, transparent roof that would flood the interior with natural light, a vast and airy space that would make the stone structures of the past feel claustrophobic and dark. But as the deadline loomed, a significant problem emerged. Eleanor, poring over the stress calculations for the main trusses, discovered a fatal flaw. The sheer span of the roof, though aesthetically perfect, would place an unbearable load on the central iron joints. In a fierce wind, or under the weight of a heavy snow, the entire structure could fail. The numbers simply did not lie. Her pencil stilled, and the usual rhythm of their work came to an abrupt, terrifying halt. The air in the room, once filled with the energy of creation, now held the heavy weight of defeat. "It can't be," Elias said, staring at the numbers. He had felt the design in his bones. It felt right. Eleanor shook her head, her face pale in the gaslight. "The physics are clear, Elias. The material cannot withstand that kind of stress. We would need a central support beam, something massive and ugly. It would ruin the entire design." For days, they worked in a state of quiet despair, trying to find a solution. They tried different angles, different alloys, but every calculation led to the same result. The grand, unsupported span was impossible. Elias's dream of a light, soaring roof seemed to be just that, a dream, beautiful but unachievable. He felt the familiar weight of his father's words returning to him. Iron is tired. Maybe Gideon had been right all along. But then, one night, exhausted and on the verge of giving up, Elias stood by the window, watching the rain wash the soot from the panes. His mind, free from the confines of numbers and drafts, drifted back to the foundry. He remembered Master Thomas, his gruff voice and his calloused hands. He remembered watching the men forge the great iron pieces, not with a single, massive hammer, but with a series of smaller, more precise blows. He remembered the feeling of a heated piece of iron being tempered, its very molecular structure changed by a sudden plunge into cold water. He remembered the way a forged piece of iron had a different kind of strength, a resilience that cast iron lacked. He turned to Eleanor, his eyes wide with a new idea. "It's not the design that's wrong," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "It's the method. We don't cast the trusses. We forge them. We use wrought iron, not cast iron. We can forge the curve, tempering the metal to give it a strength that the calculations can't even account for. The material itself will have a memory of its own shaping, a resilience from being beaten into form." Eleanor stared at him, her scientific mind grappling with the craftsman's intuition. It was a leap of faith, a concept that no architect would ever consider. But she looked at the conviction in his eyes, and she saw the practical knowledge that his hands, not just his mind, held. She sat at her desk and, with a newfound sense of purpose, began to run the new calculations. Wrought iron, a material that had been used for centuries, but never on this scale, had a different tensile strength. It was stronger, more resilient. The numbers, slowly, painstakingly, began to work. The design was no longer a dream, it was an achievable masterpiece. With renewed vigor, they worked through the final hours, their fingers smudged with ink, their minds racing. They completed the final blueprints, a massive roll of paper detailing every single curve, every joint, every single glass panel. It was a document that was both a work of art and a triumph of engineering. They delivered it just minutes before the deadline, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits filled with an unshakable belief. They had not just designed a building, they had designed a philosophy, a perfect marriage of two different worlds. They had built a monument to both the old world's strength and the new world's light. They had built their glass fortress. Part 6, The Verdict of the Past. The frantic energy of creation, a beautiful and consuming fire that had fueled Elias and Eleanor for weeks, was now replaced by a tense, agonizing stillness. The great roll of blueprints, once a living document of their shared ambition, was now just one of many submissions locked away in a vast, impersonal vault. The silence that followed the submission of their design was more deafening than the clang of any hammer or the roar of any furnace. Elias and Eleanor found themselves adrift in a sea of waiting, their minds replaying every single line, every single calculation, every curve of iron, 100 times over. They had built their glass fortress, a monument to their faith, and now it was subject to the judgment of a world that was largely unprepared for its existence. The pressure of the silence was immense. Elias would wake in the middle of the night, his body drenched in a cold sweat, his mind racing through a nightmare scenario, a hairline crack in a forgotten joint, a miscalculation in a stress point, a gust of wind that would prove his wrought iron theories were nothing more than a craftsman's hopeful delusion. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, would find herself staring at blank walls, her mind desperately seeking a new set of figures, a new equation that would somehow prove that the numbers were right, that they had not foolishly gambled their reputations and their future on a beautiful, impossible dream. The confidence they had felt in the heat of creation began to erode, replaced by a cold, nagging self-doubt that whispered in the quiet hours. But their design was too radical to remain hidden. Within days, leaks to the press and rumors from the judging committee began to circulate. The newspapers had a field day. The established papers, those who championed the classical arts and old world traditions, were quick to condemn it. A glass monstrosity, declared the London Chronicle, its headline a direct and brutal assault on their vision. The accompanying article, undoubtedly influenced by the likes of Sir Alistair Finch, called the design a bizarre and fragile greenhouse, an insult to the eternal dignity of London's great railway legacy. It was described as a temporary, frivolous structure, more suited for the growing of exotic orchids than the grand passage of modern industry. Yet, not all of the press was so harsh. A smaller, more progressive journal praised its audacity, calling it the dawn of a new age. It spoke of the design's honesty, its celebration of light, and its brave rejection of the heavy, dark monuments of the past. To the public, the idea was a subject of immense fascination. People argued in the streets, in pubs, and in their homes. Some were horrified, seeing it as a symbol of the vulgarity of the industrial age. Others were captivated, drawn to the idea of a building that was so transparent, so filled with light. Elias and Eleanor would read these articles together, a quiet, shared moment of both pain and validation. For every brutal critique, there was a quiet voice of support, a small sign that their message was, in fact, getting through. The true judgment, however, was taking place in a wood-paneled room, a world away from the city's debates. The judging committee, composed of London's most venerable and established architects, engineers, and public figures, gathered to make their final decision. Their leader, the imposing and self-assured Sir Alistair Finch, sat at the head of the long table. His firm's design, a grand stone edifice with a soaring, Gothic revival spire, was spread out before them, a safe, familiar, and undeniably impressive choice. The other judges nodded in silent, unanimous approval. There was little to discuss. The vote seemed a mere formality. But then, a younger assistant, his hands trembling slightly, brought out the final design, the blueprint for the glass fortress. As the immense roll was unfurled across the table, a hushed gasp went around the room. The judges, who had seen thousands of blueprints in their long careers, had never seen anything like it. The sheer, unsupported span of the glass roof was breathtaking in its audacity. The delicate, repeating pattern of the iron trusses, a thing of beauty in its own right, was a stark contrast to the heavy lines they were accustomed to. The room, which had been filled with the predictable hum of professional courtesy, was now thick with an uneasy silence. Sir Alistair Finch was the first to speak. He did not yell or curse, he simply laughed, a dry, cold sound that held no humor. "A folly," he declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "A child's drawing. It is an insult to the very principles of our art." He pointed to a drawing of a joint where a glass panel met an iron rib, and his contempt was palpable. "This is not architecture. It is a mere assembly of prefabricated parts, an engineering stunt. There is no soul in it, no hand of the master craftsman." He spoke of the permanence of stone, of the hallowed tradition of building for the ages, not for the fleeting novelty of a new material. He saw not a new kind of building, but the very destruction of everything he held sacred. But a single, dissenting voice broke through. Lord Henry Kensington, a man of quiet intelligence and immense curiosity, had been the one to insist on judging every submission, no matter how unconventional. He was an engineer by training before inheriting his title, and he had a deep respect for both form and function. He leaned forward, his spectacles glinting in the light. "I see a soul in it, Sir Alistair," he said, his voice calm and firm. "I see an honest use of a material. What I do not see is how it stands." He looked at the design, his brow furrowed in concentration. "My team and I have spent days trying to find this structural flaw. On paper, it should collapse. But the calculations, though unorthodox, are sound. The wrought iron you dismiss. It has a different tensile strength. The forging process would indeed give it a resilience that cast iron lacks." "Tell me," he asked, turning his gaze toward the blueprint's notes, "who is this man, this Elias, who understands iron not just as a builder, but as a master smith?" The question hung in the air, a silent challenge to the entire committee. A fissure had opened in their unanimous front. Sir Alistair could dismiss the design as a folly, but he could not dismiss the cold, hard logic of the numbers. He was faced with a truth he could not comprehend, that a new, revolutionary kind of strength was not in a book or a classical drawing, but in the hands of a craftsman who had learned his trade in the heart of a furnace. The debate raged on for hours, the air thick with heated arguments. The votes were cast, but they were split. The old guard held their ground, refusing to endorse what they considered a heresy. But the progressive judges, swayed by the undeniable logic of the design and the quiet brilliance of its engineering, refused to condemn it. The meeting ended without a verdict. The final decision was postponed, a testament to the sheer audacity of the design that had shaken the very foundations of London's architectural world. Elias and Eleanor, unaware of the tumultuous debate, received the news in a simple note. No winner had been chosen. The competition was still open. Their hearts sank, but a moment later, a quiet spark of hope ignited. They had not been dismissed. They had forced a debate. Their design was still in the running. The wait was not over, but the game had fundamentally changed. They had not just entered a competition, they had started a revolution. Part 7. The shadow of doubt. The postponement of the verdict, once a small spark of hope, began to feel like a slow, agonizing fire. The initial relief that their design had not been immediately dismissed faded into a tense, gnawing uncertainty. The judge's silence was no longer a sign of thoughtful consideration, it was a vast, heavy void that swallowed their hopes and magnified their fears. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into a bleak, endless season of waiting. The creative energy that had once filled their small office was replaced by a suffocating stillness, broken only by the nervous shuffling of papers and the soft, repetitive tap of a pencil on a desk. For Eleanor, the wait was a test of her resolve. The city's architectural establishment, a network of old money and older traditions, was not just silent, it was actively hostile. She was a woman in a man's world, and their partnership with an uncredentialed laborer like Elias was seen as an unforgivable act of rebellion. She began to receive anonymous letters filled with thinly veiled insults about her vulgar taste and her reckless ambition. The firm of Sir Alistair Finch, a well-oiled machine of influence and power, began to make quiet inquiries into her family's financial affairs and her firm's professional history, searching for any weakness to exploit. Eleanor, a woman who had always relied on the unassailable logic of numbers and reason, felt the cold, slimy presence of a game played with different rules. For Elias, the pressure was far more personal. The very moment he had chosen to walk away from his father's world, the moment of his greatest courage, now seemed to haunt him. He would find himself wandering the streets of London, drawn to the grimy, smoke-filled foundry districts, a place that felt like home. He would watch the men, their hands blackened with soot, as they forged great, solid beams of iron, and he would remember the brutal honesty of the work. But the beauty of the foundry was a harsh beauty, a brutal, unyielding strength that did not reflect the light and grace of his design. He found himself questioning everything. Was his dream just a beautiful lie? Was Gideon right? Was he chasing something flimsy and temporary, a fleeting vision built on hubris rather than the solid, enduring truth of stone? One afternoon, a particularly brutal article appeared in the press, its words honed to a razor's edge. The headline, "A Laborer's Folly," was a direct and malicious attack on him. The article, clearly leaked by someone with insider knowledge, spoke of a deluded commoner and his misguided attempt to masquerade as an architect. It scoffed at his lack of formal training and at his reckless reliance on a new, unproven form of engineering. It was a direct, emotional blow, designed to hit him where he was most vulnerable. Elias read the article, his hands trembling, the cruel words a physical weight in his stomach. He saw in its lines a reflection of his own darkest fears. He was not an architect, he was a boy who had run away from home to chase a dream. That evening, he found himself walking toward his father's old workshop. He did not intend to enter, he just needed to see it, to feel the silent presence of the past. He stood across the street in the gathering gloom, watching as a young apprentice, a boy who was just a few years younger than Elias when he had first started, swept the stone dust from the front step. The sight of his old life, so peaceful and so certain, filled him with a profound sense of loneliness. He had traded this quiet dignity for the chaos and uncertainty of a world that wanted to reject him. The longing to return was a deep, physical ache in his chest. But as he stood there, his eyes drifted toward the new railway bridge in the distance, a graceful, skeletal form that pierced the foggy sky. He remembered the feeling of awe it had inspired in him. He remembered the raw, honest power of the foundry, and then he thought of Eleanor, of her unwavering belief in his vision, and of the weeks they had spent building their glass fortress, a monument not just to his dream, but to their shared courage. He knew that the path he had chosen was harder, more fraught with danger and doubt, but it was also the only path that felt true. To give up now would be a betrayal not just of his dream, but of every single person who had believed in it. From Master Thomas to Eleanor, he turned and walked away from his father's world, a new sense of purpose hardening in his eyes. He returned to Eleanor's office and found her sitting at her desk, her head in her hands, a similar look of profound exhaustion on her face. She looked up and saw the change in him. He didn't need to say a word. He simply sat down at his drawing board and began to sketch, Anne knew, fierce determination in every line. He was done with self-doubt. They had a battle to fight, and they would not fight it with words or with social graces, but with the cold, hard logic of their design. Their moment of clarity, however, was fleeting. The next morning, a sealed envelope arrived at their office. It was from the judging committee. Their hearts sank, both of them bracing for the final, devastating verdict. But the note inside was not a rejection. It was a summons. The judges, still divided and unable to reach a consensus, had called them in for a final, in-person presentation. They would have one chance to defend their design, to argue its merits not on paper, but in person, against the very men who wished to see them fail. The game was no longer in the shadows. The final act was at hand. Part 8. The moment of truth. The room where the judges convened was not merely a chamber for deliberation, it was a mausoleum of architectural tradition. Its walls were paneled in dark, unforgiving mahogany, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen that reflected the somber light of the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Heavy velvet drapes, the color of dried blood, hung over tall windows, blocking out the light of the modern city and trapping the dusty air of the past. Portraits of stern-faced men, the masters of a bygone era, hung in silent judgment, their eyes following every movement. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, aged paper, and the unspoken weight of centuries of tradition. Elias and Eleanor entered this solemn space, a stark contrast to their surroundings. Elias, with his hands still bearing the faint marks of a laborer, his simple suit feeling stiff and ill-fitting, was a man from the workshop in a world of scholars. Eleanor, a woman in a room filled with men, carried herself with a quiet dignity, her dark dress a symbol of her professional solemnity. They carried their massive rolled blueprints and a small, delicate model, a miniature testament to a grand vision. As they walked toward the long table where the committee sat, the hushed silence of the room felt like a physical pressure on Elias's lungs. The judges, a circle of grave, severe-looking men, watched their approach. Sir Alistair Finch sat at the center, his posture radiating an air of weary disdain, as if he had already heard the outcome of a play he had written himself. Eleanor unrolled the blueprints on the table, their vastness filling the space. Elias carefully placed their model in the center, a perfectly crafted miniature of a single joint, showcasing the elegant fusion of their forged iron and glass. Eleanor spoke first. Her voice, though soft, was clear and precise, cutting through the silence with the cold, hard logic of numbers. She presented the design with impeccable grace, explaining the calculations, the stress points, the revolutionary use of wrought iron to achieve a span that would be impossible with traditional materials. She spoke the language of geometry, of engineering, of physics, a language the men in the room understood, but one they felt had no place in the heart of true architecture. As she finished, a palpable skepticism hung in the air. A judge leaned forward. "This is all well and good on paper, Miss Vance," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "But what of the material? How do you account for the unreliability of a factory-made product? We cannot trust the soul of a building to a material that is not hewn from the earth by a master's hand." Elias, who had stood silently by, felt a sudden, fierce rush of purpose. This was his moment. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the skeptical judge. "Sir," he said, his voice raw and honest, "I can speak to the soul of the material because I have felt its heart." He ignored the disapproving glances of the committee and began to speak not of blueprints, but of his life. He spoke of the scent of stone dust, of his father's unwavering belief in the earth's permanence. Then, his voice gaining a quiet power, he spoke of the heat of the Birmingham foundry, of the blinding light of molten iron, of the rhythmic thunder of the steam hammer. "Iron is not a factory product," he said, his hand gesturing to the small model on the table. "It is a spirit tamed by fire. When it is forged, it remembers the force that shapes it. It has a resilience, a strength that is born not in a factory, but in a crucible of fire and will. My father taught me the soul of stone. Master Thomas taught me the heart of iron. This building," he said, his voice now a low, resonant plea, "is not a betrayal of the past. It is a promise to the future." The committee was stunned into silence. They were not accustomed to this kind of passion, this kind of unvarnished honesty. They were used to numbers and figures, to dry, academic arguments. They looked from Elias's impassioned face to Eleanor's proud, resolute one, and then back to the model, which now seemed to hum with a new kind of life. Sir Alistair Finch, his face a mask of furious contempt, finally stood. "You speak with the passion of a man who has lost his way," he thundered, his voice filling the room with the force of his long-held convictions. "You speak of a soul in a material that is crude and common. You claim to honor the past, yet you reject its very essence, the permanence of stone, the artistry of the hand. You and your associate have designed a glorified greenhouse, a fragile bauble that will mock the very history of our city. There is no beauty in this, only a vulgar display of brute engineering." The air in the room was thick with tension, a battle of philosophies played out in a single, desperate moment. Eleanor took a step forward, her voice filled with a calm defiance. "Beauty is not exclusive to stone, Sir Alistair," she said. "Beauty can be found in honesty of form, in the triumph of light over shadow. This building will not stand for the past, but for the present, for the people who live and work in this city, who deserve a gateway that is not a dark, heavy fortress, but a cathedral of light and air." Elias, in a final, impulsive act, picked up the small model from the table and held it up to the light of the chandelier. He turned it, and the polished iron and glass caught the light, refracting it into 100 tiny, shimmering points. "This," he said, his voice filled with a powerful, unshakable conviction, is not just a joint. It is a truth. It is the marriage of two worlds. It is strength without weight, and light without boundary. He held it there, his gaze challenging every man in the room. The room fell into a profound and lasting silence. The judges looked from the small, glowing object in Elias's hand to the stern portraits on the wall, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed their faces. Elias and Eleanor had not just presented a blueprint, they had stood for a new world, a new way of seeing, a new kind of beauty. They had laid a challenge at the feet of an entire era, and for a long, quiet moment, no one in the room had an answer. The verdict was still unwritten, but the first true victory had just been won. Part 9. A glimmer of triumph. The moments after their presentation were a disorienting blur of sensation. Elias and Eleanor walked out of the somber, wood-paneled room and into the noise of the London street, the clatter of carriage wheels and the cries of vendors assaulting their senses. The weight of the blueprints was gone, replaced by a profound, physical exhaustion that settled deep in their bones. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They had laid their hearts bare, argued not just for a building but for a new way of seeing the world, and now all they could do was wait. The victory or defeat was no longer in their hands. The city that had once felt so full of purpose and possibility now seemed distant, surreal. They retreated to Eleanor's small office, a sanctuary of their shared vision. They sat in a tired, companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, replaying every word spoken, every gesture made, wondering if it had been enough. Elias stared at the empty space on the drafting board where their great blueprint had once been, feeling a sense of emptiness. He had lived for this purpose for months, and now that purpose was gone, replaced by a vast, unfillable void of uncertainty. Meanwhile, in the mahogany chamber, the silence that had followed Elias's final, impassioned plea gave way to a storm of debate. The Conservative judges, led by a visibly shaken and furious Sir Alistair Finch, railed against the audacity of the design. They called it irresponsible, un-English, and a betrayal of our architectural heritage. They argued that a building must be a symbol of permanence, not of fleeting, technological novelty. They were the keepers of the flame, and they saw a dangerous heretic trying to snuff it out. But a new force had entered the chamber. Lord Henry Kensington, a man whose quiet demeanour had always masked a profound intellect, now spoke with a fiery conviction. He did not speak of traditions, but of truth. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing out with a newfound authority, "we have just been witness to a true triumph of form and function. This is not a folly, it is a solution. They have solved a problem that has plagued our city, how to build with both grace and immense scale. The young man, this laborer you so easily dismiss, showed us that iron can have a soul. He showed us that a building can be honest about its own construction, that it does not need to hide its strength behind a facade of false tradition." He walked to the window and pulled back the heavy drape, allowing a stream of grimy London light to flood the room. "The world outside is changing. It is built on steam and iron. Are we, the arbiters of taste and progress, to remain trapped in the past? This design is not an insult to our heritage, it is the natural evolution of it. It takes the very principles we have held dear in honesty, strength, beauty, and redefines them for a new age." The debate raged on for hours, a philosophical war of wills played out in a grand room. The votes were cast, and the tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The final count was not unanimous. It was a testament to the deep divide between the old and the new. But it was decisive. By the slimmest of margins, The motion to accept the design of Elias and Eleanor was passed. The future had just won. The news reached them in the most understated of ways. The following morning, a single, unassuming envelope was slipped under the door of Eleanor's office. The official seal was not one of rejection, but of acceptance. Elias, who had been staring at the same spot on the floor for what felt like hours, reached for it with a trembling hand. He opened the letter and read the single, most important line of his life. "The committee is pleased to inform you that your design has been selected as the winning entry for the new London railway station. Construction will begin in the coming year." There was no shouting, no joyous celebration. Instead, a profound, overwhelming quiet settled over the room. Elias sank into a chair, the letter clutched in his hand, his eyes welling with tears. Eleanor, her face a mask of shock, stood over him, her own silent tears falling onto the crumpled paper. They had done it. Against all odds, against the weight of tradition and the scorn of the entire establishment, they had won. The victory was not a roar, but a silent, profound ache of relief and exhausted triumph. The news spread like wildfire. The same newspapers that had mocked their design were now forced to feature it on their front pages. A new era for London architecture. Read the headline of the same paper that had so cruelly dismissed them. Sir Alistair Finch's firm was silent, their defeat a public spectacle. The city was divided, but the outcome was undeniable. The glass fortress would be built. That evening, as the gas lights flickered on across the city, casting their warm, solitary glow, Elias found himself walking. He did not go to a pub, nor did he seek out the celebration that awaited him. He found himself, once again, standing across from his father's workshop. The windows were dark, the sounds of the day's work were gone. He looked at the quiet, enduring silence of the stone blocks and felt a mix of immense pride and a deep, crushing sorrow. He had defied his father's world and won, but he had done so alone. He wondered if the news had reached Gideon's ears, and if it had, what his father thought of the son who had just won the future by turning his back on the past. Part 10, The First Foundation. The victory was not a final destination, it was a starting line. The initial swell of triumph that followed the verdict slowly gave way to the immense, daunting reality of what lay ahead. A blueprint, no matter how revolutionary, was just ink on paper. To turn the glass fortress into a physical monument required a different kind of courage. Elias and Eleanor had won a battle of ideas, but the war of construction, with its unforgiving truths and unyielding materials, was just beginning. The construction site was not the pristine, sunlit vision of their drawings. It was a chaotic, muddy landscape, a world of deep pits, towering cranes, and a ceaseless tide of men and machines. The air, once filled with the theoretical silence of a blueprint, was now thick with the sound of steam engines hissing, the shouts of foremen, and the rhythmic thump of pile drivers. For Elias, this was a familiar world, a world of honest labor, but he now stood on the other side of the fence. He was no longer a worker with a hammer, but a designer, a supervisor. He traded his work clothes for a suit. His calloused hands now held a clipboard instead of a chisel. This new role was fraught with an immediate and palpable resistance. The construction crews, a grizzled and practical lot who had built with brick and timber for decades, looked upon Elias and Eleanor with open skepticism. They saw two young, untested architects, one a woman, the other a stonemason's boy with a design that seemed to defy the very laws of common sense. The chief foreman, a hardened, no-nonsense man named Foreman Miller, was the loudest voice of this resistance. Miller had a face like a worn leather glove and eyes that held the hard-won wisdom of 1,000 jobs. He had no time for theory. Iron and glass, he scoffed to Eleanor on their first day, his voice a low growl. "You'll be building a bloody birdcage, miss. It'll collapse with the first good wind." Eleanor, with her meticulous calculations, tried to explain the stress diagrams, the tensile strength of the wrought iron. But Miller only shook his head. "I don't read paper, ma'am. I read the ground. And this ground wants something solid, not something that looks like it belongs in a garden." The men, echoing his sentiment, regarded them with a wary, professional distance. They would follow orders, but there was no respect, no belief in the project. Elias, understanding the language of a working man, knew that he could not win them over with words. He had to win them over with his hands. A few days into the foundation work, a massive stone block, intended for the building's base, became lodged in the mud. It swayed too much for the pulley system to dislodge. The men struggled, cursing and straining, but the block would not move. Foreman Miller was on the verge of calling it a day, a costly delay in an already ambitious schedule. Elias walked over, a quiet calm in his eyes. He didn't offer a suggestion, he simply began to work. He found a lever, a piece of old timber, and a small, precise opening in the mud beneath the stone. He showed Miller and the others how to use the lever to apply force to a specific point, creating just enough leverage to break the block's suction with the earth. The men stared, surprised by his simple, practical solution. He then grabbed a shovel and, with a silent, determined effort, began to dig at the mud himself, his movements fluid and efficient. The other workers, seeing a designer willing to get his hands dirty, joined him. Within minutes, the block was free. Miller looked at him, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. He said nothing, but the next morning, he began to address Elias not as Sir, but as Mr. Elias. The first seed of respect had been planted. The construction of the first great iron truss was a monumental undertaking, the centerpiece of the project and a true test of their design. It was a massive, elegant curve of wrought iron, a testament to the skill of the foundry workers in Birmingham. It arrived on a series of flatbed rail cars, its size and complexity dwarfing the men who would lift it. The entire crew, including Foreman Miller, was nervous. A miscalculation, a single slip of a chain, and the entire truss could be bent, its structural integrity destroyed. Elias and Eleanor were at the center of the operation. Eleanor, with her precise measurements and charts, guided the crane operators. Elias, standing on the muddy ground, felt the familiar pull of the material. He spoke the language of iron, not with words but with gestures. He had the foreman place a hand on the truss, urging him to feel its weight and balance. He had the men tap it with a hammer, listening for the clear, resonant ring that would tell them the metal was sound. The silence was thick with tension as the great, curving beam rose slowly into the air, a dark, graceful arc against the grey London sky. It was a moment of sheer, terrifying beauty. The entire site held its breath. The truss swung and swayed, a pendulum of immense, concentrated force. Elias watched it, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling a connection to the material that was as deep as any stone he had ever worked with. The moment it finally locked into its place, its iron joints fitting together with a quiet click, a collective sigh of relief went up from the crew. It was in that moment that they stopped seeing a building made of fragile glass and thin iron. They saw a structure that was truly strong, a vision that defied their expectations. That evening, exhausted and covered in mud, Elias returned to his apartment. He was no longer just a designer, he was a builder, but a part of him still felt incomplete. He sat at his desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. He wrote in a hand that was now a mix of his father's careful script and the bold strokes of an architect. He wrote to Gideon, a simple letter filled not with boastful pride, but with the quiet truth of his work. He wrote of the weight of the iron, the heart of the furnace, the honesty of the labor. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked him to come and see. He had not abandoned the past, he had simply found a way to carry its lessons into the future. Part 11. The Ghost and the Forge. The letter Elias wrote to his father was not a plea for forgiveness or a boastful proclamation of victory. It was a simple, honest bridge cast across a chasm of silence and time. It spoke not of blueprints or awards, but of the mud on his boots, the heat of the iron, and the honest labor of his hands. He asked Gideon to come, not to see what his son had accomplished, but to witness the marriage of two worlds. He folded the paper with a trembling hand, a silent offering to a past he could not fully abandon. For a week, there was no reply. Elias, despite his newfound purpose, felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He would watch the mail daily, his heart sinking with each empty day. He knew Gideon well enough to know that his silence was not a sign of indifference, but of a man grappling with a profound, internal conflict. Gideon, in his quiet workshop, was indeed at war with himself. Elias's letter sat on his workbench, a stark white intrusion in his world of stone dust and ancient tools. He had heard the rumors, of course, the papers were filled with them. Gideon's son builds a glass castle, a mason's folly, or a new masterpiece. His colleagues in the stonemasons guild shook their heads in silent disapproval, seeing it as a betrayal of their timeless craft. To them, Elias had run away from an honorable trade to play with the frivolous whims of the new age. Gideon's pride was immense, but so was his sense of loss. He had raised his son to be a part of a legacy that was older than the empire itself, and Elias had chosen to walk a different path. He could not, in good conscience, support this folly, and yet, the letter was so honest. It was filled with the language of a craftsman, a language he had taught his son himself. He found himself picking it up again and again, his thumb rubbing over the words, the heart of the furnace. Driven by a curiosity that outweighed his pride and his convictions, Gideon finally made the journey. He took the new railway line, the same one his son was building a terminal for. The locomotive, a noisy, iron beast, felt alien and crude to his sensibilities. He arrived at the construction site early one morning, the great cranes already swinging their heavy burdens, the air filled with the clang of metal and the shouts of the men. He stood on the edge of the muddy site, a ghost from another era, a solemn figure in his war tweed coat, watching in quiet, unblinking awe. He saw the scale of it first, a massive, steel skeleton, a graceful latticework of iron trusses, was rising toward the sky. It was not a building, it was a cathedral of lines and open space. It was not a heavy, grounded structure, but a thing of flight, a birdcage of incredible, terrifying strength. His eyes, trained to find the flaws in a foundation, searched for a single point of weakness, a single stone out of place, but he found none. The base of the structure was solid and true, built with the same uncompromising honesty he taught his son. He saw Elias then, not a boy, but a man. He was covered in mud and grime, standing with Foreman Miller, his hands gesturing with a new confidence, his voice carrying an authority Gideon had never heard before. He was no longer a follower, he was a leader, a master in his own right. The men listened to him, not with the grudging respect of a worker for a supervisor, but with the quiet reverence of a craftsman for a man who understood his trade. Gideon saw one of the workers stop what he was doing and point to a truss. Elias went over, touched the iron, and spoke a few words, and the worker nodded in understanding. This was the soul of the iron he had written about. This was the new language. The long-awaited reunion was not a moment of tearful embraces. It was a simple, quiet event. Gideon walked toward Elias, who saw him across the site and stopped dead in his tracks, a look of profound shock and hope on his face. He walked toward his father, the distance between them feeling like 1,000 miles. They did not speak for a long moment, simply staring at one another. Finally, Gideon spoke, his voice low and filled with a complex, unreadable emotion. It's not a house," he said, his words a bewildered admission of the sheer scale of the project. "It's a gateway, Father," Elias responded, his voice filled with a tremor of emotion. "It's a place for light to enter the city." They talked for hours, walking through the mud and chaos. Elias showed him the trusses, explaining their design. He spoke of the wrought iron, of Master Thomas, and of the way he had taken the very principles Gideon had taught him and applied them to a new material. He told him of Eleanor, of their partnership, and of the battles they had fought to get here. Gideon listened, his silence a sign of his growing acceptance. He finally stopped, his hand resting on a massive iron column. He did not speak of his forgiveness, but of a newfound, grudging respect. "It's a broken bar honest," he said softly, a simple, profound admission that carried more weight than any formal praise. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows on the construction site. It was in that moment, when Elias felt the immense weight of his father's silent acceptance, that the true crisis came. A younger foreman came running toward them, his face pale with fear. "Mr. Elias," he shouted, "we have a problem. The main supports for the central arch, the ones forged in Birmingham they're not holding true. The material is flawed." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The material was flawed. Not the design. The very iron he had so passionately defended, the material he had learned to trust, was failing. The foreman showed them a series of small, almost invisible cracks running along a massive, load-bearing truss. The flaw was not in the design, but in the brutal, unpredictable nature of the industrial process. They had built a beautiful theory, but reality, in its cruel, unyielding way, had found a way to break it. The entire project, their reputations, and Elias's long-sought reconciliation with his father, all of it was suddenly at risk. Part 12, The Final Testament. The foreman's shouted words hung in the air, a physical weight in the throat of every man on the site. A flaw, not in the design, but in the material itself. The main load-bearing trusses, the very heart of the building, were compromised. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a chilling confirmation of his deepest, most primal fear. The voice of his father, whispering "Iron is tired," echoed in his mind. The triumph they had fought so hard to win was now poised on the brink of catastrophic failure. Eleanor, ever the scientist, went to the compromised trusses with a series of gauges and charts, but the flaw was invisible to her equations. It was a silent, treacherous betrayal in the very molecular structure of the metal, a tiny crack in the iron soul that could not be accounted for on a blueprint. Foreman Miller, a man of brutal honesty, gave Elias a look of profound disappointment. "Told you so," his eyes seemed to say. "A man can't trust what he can't see." The workers, their faces grim, began to pack up their tools, Their faith in the project shattered. The project was not a monument to light, it was a monument to hubris. But in that moment of collective despair, a quiet, unyielding presence cut through the chaos. Gideon, who had stood silently observing, walked forward. He did not look at the gauges or the charts. He reached out a hand, his fingers, rough from a lifetime of shaping stone, touching the cold, metallic surface of the truss. He did not see a flaw in a piece of industrial metal, he saw a weakness, a lack of honesty in the material, the same kind of subtle betrayal he had spent a lifetime guarding against in granite and marble. His eyes, trained to find a fault line in a block of stone from a single, distant tap of a hammer, now saw the invisible truth in the iron. The forge was too hot, Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. Or the metal was cooled too quickly. It is brittle. He ran his hand along the length of the truss, feeling for the subtle variations in its temperature and texture. There is a weakness here, at the joint, where the fire left a whisper of doubt. Eleanor, her mind reeling, looked at him with disbelief. "How can you know that?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and frustration. "The calculations are sound, the material was certified." Gideon smiled, a slow, sad smile. "Numbers are for things that are certain, Miss Vance," he said. "Stone is never certain, nor is iron. You must feel it." He looked at Elias, a profound understanding passing between them. "Your father taught you the soul of the stone. It's the same soul, my son. It just has a different story." The solution came not from an engineering manual, but from an ancient, half-forgotten wisdom. Gideon proposed a series of small, custom-made braces, not of iron, but of a specially cut, polished limestone, carefully positioned to distribute the weight and absorb the stress at the point of the flaw. It was an audacious idea, a perfect marriage of his world and his son's. The stone would bear the burden of the iron's weakness, turning a flaw into a point of profound, beautiful strength. The work that followed was a symphony of collaboration. Elias worked alongside his father, his hands now a conduit between the two worlds. He learned from Gideon how to shape the stone for its new purpose, feeling the familiar weight of the chisel in his hand. Eleanor provided the precise measurements, her architectural genius creating a seamless, elegant blend of the two materials. Foreman Miller, a man who had sworn he would never build with anything so foolish, watched in silent wonder, his skepticism replaced by a quiet respect for this impossible solution. The workers, seeing a master stonemason and a master of iron working together, were filled with a new sense of purpose. The final phase of the construction was not just the building of a structure, it was the building of a bond. As the last of the glass panels was placed into the now braced frame, the glass fortress stood complete, a triumph over doubt, a monument not just to the power of a new material, but to the enduring wisdom of the old. The day of the official opening was a magnificent spectacle. The city, which had followed the project with a mix of fascination and fear, turned out in a grand procession. The first train, a powerful, gleaming symbol of the future, pulled slowly into the station. The grand, soaring roof, now fully transparent, bathed the entire interior in a breathtaking, ethereal light. The air was filled with the sounds of 1,000 voices, their collective awe a single, unified sound. It was a cathedral of light and air, a testament to the idea that a building could be both honest about its materials and glorious in its form. It was a gateway to a new world. Elias stood on the main platform, watching the light stream in, a quiet sense of triumph filling his soul. He had not just built a building, he had built a bridge between stone and iron, between his father's world and his own. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his father standing beside him. Gideon did not speak. He simply looked up at the great, transparent roof, at the subtle, barely visible lines of the limestone braces, and then back at his son. A slow, proud smile spread across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was his own personal chisel, the one he had used for a lifetime. He put it in Elias's hand, a silent gesture that needed no words. Elias looked at the tool, his heart swelling with a mix of love, sorrow, and profound gratitude. He had not betrayed his father. He had not abandoned his heritage. He had simply found a new way to honor it. The glass fortress stood not as a symbol of defiance, but as a final, living testament to the beautiful, enduring truth that the soul of a craftsman could be found in the heart of a stone, a piece of iron, and in the hands that brought them together to build something that would not only stand for an age but also change the world.